This is really the continuation of the first talk I gave this morning. As I mentioned, CRS syndrome is not a discrete disease. Typically, we divide sinusitis into that with polyps and that without polyps. Historically, we talked about pathophysiology. Polyps was believed to be caused by some sort of allergy, some sort of odd allergy, while non-polypoid sinusitis was undertreated or untreated or ineffectively treated infection. There were a number of, this was obviously very simplistic, but there were a number of studies really began with the Mayo Clinic's theory that fungus was the main driver, that superantigens, biofilms, microbiome, allergy in some form still was thought to play a role. And on the host side, it was a belief that eicosanoids, perhaps effective alkaloid metabolism, and then our hypothesis that there was something wrong with the immune barrier. And there was a lot of research done into exactly what was going on, and ultimately, all of those hypotheses probably have measures of truth in them. They vary in their importance in an individual patient, but none of them are really completely wrong. The way we think now about the pathophysiology of chronic sinusitis and nasal polyposis is that there's an interface really at the in the nose where you inhale exogenous material, some of the pollutants, some cigarette smoke, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and there's an interaction at the mucosal surface. And the immune system, for the most part, tolerates this, absorbs it in the mucus, and there's no real immune response. But in patients that develop sinusitis over years, and typically the age of onset is in the 40s, the barrier is penetrated and there's a self-perpetuating immune response that occurs. And this chronic inflammation results in this pathophysiology, we think, is the driver of the process of whether you develop polyps or non-polyps. And I talked a little bit about this before, but the environmental factors, the host factors, some random events, these all vary in patients, particularly when you're looking at a 40-year span. And so it's not surprising that not all sinusitis is the same. But depending on this, you will get a particular mechanistic pathway that's incited. One or more of these pathways may be incited. And the key cells here, these innate lymphocytes, they were discovered about 5 to 10 years ago, and they actually act as the orchestra conductor for guiding immune defense responses against various pathogens, innate material, and this was not known a number of years ago, but they actually essentially regulate the immune response. And as I mentioned, morning response, there's basically 3 types of these innate lymphocytes, and they orchestrate 3 different reactions geared towards 3 different pathogens. Type 1 inflammation, which leads to a Th1 response, and Th1 cells are really geared against viruses and intracellular organisms. ILC2s are against parasites. They're also important in tissue repair, but they're geared against parasites. And ILC3s are really the basic immune defense against fungi and Staphylococcus, all external bacteria, extracellular bacteria. And there's a particular cell type that's involved, mostly neutrophils here in all 3, but particularly in the ILC3 response. And ILC2s, it's eosinophils and mast cells. They have particular cytokines, and these cytokines are key to driving the type of inflammation seen. 4, 5, and 13, particularly important for type 2, which has a tendency really to trigger nasal polyp formation. I mentioned before that if you do this very simplistic division, you can really endotype all cases of sinusitis, and depending on whether they're pure or mixed. And as I showed earlier, this there's a lot of type, this thing is dead here, but there are a lot of type 2 responses that are, let's see if I can use here. The type 2 is really the strongest in nasal polyposis. And over 50% of nasal polyps in Chicago are pure type 2 inflammation. And there's a great deal, over 50% of non-polyps also have a type 2 response. So type 2 inflammation is really probably the key to treating sinusitis. As I said, this pattern varies around the world, but it's changing in places like China, which are rapidly changing in terms of their type of healthcare. They're moving more of a Western type of societies, particularly on the coast. They're developing a chronic type 2 inflammation on a large scale, which means more asthma, more allergies, and more type 2 sinusitis. Now in Chicago, type 2 inflammation is about 60% of all sinusitis. And as I said before, what that means is that there's a higher rate of polyp formation, higher rate of treatment failure, and this goes over the inflammation again, but in more detail than I talked about this morning. These type 2 innate lymphocytes help orchestrate the response, creating this plasma cell infiltrate and these effector cells that are armed. And this goes into more detail here. This IL-13, particularly over here, can't really control this very easily. This IL-13 here is key to driving formation of polyps, but also doing many of the other things that make type 2 inflammation bad. Now, type 2 inflammation is key in driving remodeling. This is something we really didn't know. We used to think that remodeling, the fibrosis, and the polyp formation were not clearly linked to the inflammation, and that they would be separate processes driven by separate mechanisms. But that does not appear to be the case. And we already know it from the experiment that if we give biologics that stop down the inflammation, not only do you lower all the cytokine levels, but you also change the remodeling and the types of remodeling changes you see reverse. So we see it as a stepwise process, and this is a kind of an important finding. Klaus Bacher had a theory about 10 years ago that non-polypoid sinusitis was really a remodeling disease, and polyps were a inflammatory disease. Well, they're both inflammatory diseases, and they're both linked to remodeling. As I said, nasal polyps are, you see them here, it's very obvious, and what they are, they're not collagen. The study shows here very clearly, you can see in the lower corner there, that nasal polyps do not have more collagen. What they have are more fiber. So you can think of them as a blood clot. This was from a postdoc in our laboratory that showed that really it's a fibrin link. It's kind of like a blood clot. And that link, that matrix, draws in water. And here, this shows it here fairly clearly that, I don't know if I can get this thing to work at all, but it shows that this matrix here, there's a tissue extravasation, just like any inflammation that flows out of the blood vessels. And fibrinogen forms fibrin dimers, which creates a matrix. And that is really the key for what draws in water, creates the tissue swelling, and creates the physical form of a nasal polyp. Now, under normal circumstances, you can see here there's something called TPA. This thing is really dead. TPA here, you can see on this tissue plasminogen activator, that will dissolve the fibrin matrix under normal circumstances. So anytime you get any sort of injury in the nose, you don't get nasal polyp formation. But in the presence of type 2 inflammation, the IL-13 suppresses TPA, so the fibrin matrix does not get broken down, and you'll get this expanding matrix that draws in water and forms the nasal polyp. And the TPA levels vary in anatomic sites in the nose. they're very high. The endogenous TPA levels are very high in the floor of the nose and along the septum, which is why you don't get polyps there. The ethmoid mucosa, the TPA levels are very low, so they're easy to inhibit, so that's why you get nasal polyps in that location. And this sort of illustrates it here. The TPA is actually made by the epithelial cells. So they generate this TPA, and that's what keeps the polyps from forming. So when the epithelium is either suppressed with IL-13 or also when it's damaged, and I showed you the slides this morning, it doesn't make much TPA, and that favors polyp formation. Now, there are certain bacteria that create short-chain fatty acids here, and short-chain fatty acids here can upregulate TPA formation. So theoretically, the right kind of bacteria in the nose might actually inhibit polyp formation. Now, so again, fiber cross-linking is a type of remodeling that we see in type 2 inflammation. Now, barrier damage is also as a result of type 2 inflammation. And a weakened epithelial barrier, chronically immature state, which we would call barrier failure, and here we see it in the nasal polyp, it's abnormal looking, that facilitates more, it decreases the protective function, facilitates more antigenic stimulation across the barrier, and we think drives the process. These are just examples of the epithelium in nasal polyps. And type 2 inflammation is abnormal. It results in this sort of odd kind of barrier formation that's very leaky. And this slide here shows you the whole process. The barriers penetrated, creates a feed-forward mechanism, and eventually the type 2 inflammation becomes so great, and the levels of IL-13 become so great that they suppress the TPA, and that's when you'll get polyp formation. So the barrier failure, what I was talking about there, where the barrier is actually no longer able to keep antigens out, that's probably different than the process that causes polyp or sinusitis in the first place. So we think the chronically weak barrier, the fact that the barrier itself is dysfunctional, is probably why type 2 inflammation is prone to recur and why these patients need long-term nasal steroids or potentially a biologic in the severe forms. And what about non-type 2 inflammation? I talked about type 2 inflammation. What about the other half or in non-polypoid sinusitis, and maybe the other 10% to 15% of non-type 2 polyps? Well, it turns out that the same process is used, the same fiber cross-linking, but the type 1 and also to a lesser extent type 3 cytokines also can inhibit TPA. They don't do it as well, the levels have to be higher, and there's less of a tendency to do that. But in Asia, polyps tend to be type 1 and type 3. Now what happens then is they don't have the associated barrier dysfunction, because type 1 and 3 polyp formation is the same mechanism. But this is a slide of type 1 inflammation. There is some barrier damage you can see being caused by those neutrophils. And this is type 3 similarly. But the barrier remains intact, which is why non-type 2 inflammation is much more curable, and why polyps in Asia are much more curable. They tend to respond much better to surgery than they do in the Western world. So if you look at this, the type 1 and type 3 inflammation tends to have, there's less polyp formation because you can't get the cytokine levels high enough to suppress the TPA. But there tends to be more fibrosis, the barrier remains intact, and they tend to be associated with bronchiectasis in the lower airway inflammation. Type 2 inflammation, there's fiber polyps, there's less fibrosis, there's more asthma, and it's associated with barrier failure. And in terms of treatments, type 1 and type 3 respond better in general. They respond to antibiotics better. They respond to corticosteroids weakly. They don't work as well. And surgery works very, very well. The type 2 inflammation, surgery works okay, but it tends to be temporary. The effects occur. Biologics and steroids work much more effectively. So this just illustrates the slide that I showed you this morning, that type 2 inflammation we would has
Dear
greater
doctor,
tendency to
your
cause.
time is up.
And thank you very much.